Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati Podcast, where we dive into how emerging technologies will impact the world and your bank account. I'm Trent Fowler, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, Thomas Fry. Thomas and I are futurists, keynote speakers, and consultants with decades of experience in analyzing trends and communicating new developments to audiences across the world. Reach out to us at futuratipodcast.com/contact-futurati if you'd like to hire us for consulting, to speak at your event, or to advertise on our podcast. Thomas, we just wrapped up a fascinating interview with a prominent China commentator, a person who's very well known in the Bitcoin community and who writes a lot about how Bitcoin has played out in China and the various ways in which it interfaces with the state, what they think of it, what the Chinese population thinks of it. What were your key takeaways from the conversation?
Yeah, I was surprised he went into quite great detail on kind of the whole geopolitical situation and what would happen if this happens and what would happen if that happens. He's got quite a solid basis of understanding of how things have changed in the past, and he everything in China seems to be not very rigidly defined. Everything seems like it's okay, but it's a surveillance state, so you don't want to hold too much Bitcoin. They might take it away, but you're okay if you have some, sort of thing.
Well, what struck me about it was just his command of the facts and the fact that, I don't think I said his name earlier, it's Roger Huang. So he is Chinese or knows Mandarin. I didn't ask him if he was born there, but he knows Mandarin, and so he's ethnically Chinese and knows a lot of people there and can speak the language and read it. So he knows a lot about the day-to-day details. It's very easy to kind of come away with a view of China's down on Bitcoin or whatever, but the reality is actually quite a bit more complicated than that. And because he talks to people there and he's in some of these private groups, he's able to really give us a very up-to-date picture about how the Chinese people writ large think about the technology, the extent to which you could hold it, what you can do with it, because it's not just blanket ban. They don't just round everybody up who has Bitcoin and throw them in prison. It's actually a lot more nuanced than that. So you can have it, but you can't trade it. You can have it, but you can't mine it, et cetera, et cetera. So he really knows those facts. He knows the story and the on-the-ground details, and he walked us through it with aplomb. And I really learned a lot from the episode.
Yeah, and a lot of things about what would happen if China decided to invade Taiwan.
Yeah, that came up right at the end.
Yeah, that I thought was very revealing. So you're going to want to listen to the very end.
Yeah, listen all the way to the end. It helps the algorithm, and it also has some of the best information. So without further ado, here is our episode with Roger Huang. Tonight, we're joined by Roger Huang. Roger's Would Mao Hold Bitcoin is the authoritative resource exploring Bitcoin's disruptive intersection with Chinese history. Huang not only pulls back the curtain on the specifics of this history, characters, and story, but on the larger questions that arise from the clash between state-driven Chinese tech and the open-source development that is Bitcoin. As a longtime observer, Mandarin speaker, and regular contributor to Forbes and many other platforms on the subject of Bitcoin in China, Huang is uniquely positioned to evaluate the implications for the future. If you enjoy this interview, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends, and don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com. Roger, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Love being on the show. Love the guests that y'all have had on the Bitcoin front. Lynn Alden, Professor Bailey, just happy to be on here. And I think you all are doing some really good work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to working on the problems you're working on today.
Yeah. Since Futurati is a little bit more of a general podcast, futurist podcast, I can talk a little bit about my day job. I actually work in education on digital skills such as UI, UX, data science, machine learning. So that was kind of like how I paid the bills. And this, if you look up my name and you look up some machine learning resources and stuff like that, you'll find some of my bylines out there as well. But the main reason why people ask me on podcasts is because since 2014, I was kind of one of the first writers to write about the intersect between Bitcoin and policy. And so, for example, writing about the digital yuan, writing about Bitcoin in the context of the Hong Kong protests, writing about Bitcoin in the context of different censorship contexts in the Valley Foundation, the Feminist Coalition. My interest really pretty wide, but one interest in particular that I've been really focused on is, what happens when you have technologies, let's just call them freedom tech, right, that allow people to express themselves and transact money freely. And when you encounter advanced surveillance societies or advanced surveillance states, and China is a really great example of this. In fact, China is one of the country that's probably the most advanced at, the United States does also do some other things, but China definitely has a surveillance state that is all encompassing, and is very, very, very advanced and is very on top of technical trends. And so combining that interest, seeing these technologies, what happens when censorship proof technologies meet the censor, that really drove me to write a book about Bitcoin in China, which is called Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? And so, yeah, that's kind of me. That's my interest, my background, sort of, I guess, what led me here.
So real quick question. When did you buy your first Bitcoin, and how much did you pay it, and why didn't you buy 1,000 of them?
Thomas, you're going straight for it. I came a little bit prepared because I listened to a few of these episodes, so I knew something like this was coming. So I always tell people that I have the Pete Rizzo story. I don't know if y'all know Pete Rizzo, but he's like the Bitcoin historian. If you ever see him on Twitter doing these big Bitcoin threads, and he's always mentioned he always regrets not buying more. He always regrets not being involved economically. Y'all have to remember, back in 2014, I was a very poor student. And so, I wasn't, some other people's origin stories when it comes to Bitcoin, I wasn't necessarily, I guess, partying as hard as other people or whatever. But I did buy my first Bitcoin fairly early, but it wasn't that much. And I think I've gotten more and more involved economically, as time has gone on. But it would surprise you how much, But having said that, one of my first articles is on this thing called Potcoin. I don't know if y'all. This is like a really crazy altcoin. They sent Dennis Rodman to North Korea and all this other stuff. Anyways, they gave me like a whole bunch of Potcoin, like in 2014. So some of that in Bitcoin. So you can say that I purchased it at zero, but I guess the price around there must have been like 100 or like 50 or something. Yeah, that would be that.
Have you been holding the whole time?
The one good thing about me, not to try to invite people to come attack me or anything, but I'm gonna say that I don't have that much. So if you're an attacker out there, a lot of it might have been lost in a boating accident. But I will say that I haven't lost. I didn't have large amounts to begin with, but I haven't lost large amounts in a stupid way either, I guess is the way I would put it. I definitely have held some amount through and through. But
I have an unspecified quantity of Bitcoin, which I've been holding for an unspecified amount of time. Spoken like a true maxi. I love it.
Yeah. Well, it's on my Forbes profile. I do have to put that I have some Bitcoin and Ethereum, so people know that, right? I guess I could say that I've never been hacked. I've never lost funds. I've never lost funds by having it on that's not technically true. I was stuck in one exchange for a settlement thing, but no, nothing too big. So small amounts, but small amounts consistently.
They call you diamond hands, Huang.
They should. If you all want to get that movement going, you can sit on diamond hands, Huang. But no, right now I'm more involved economically for sure than I was before when I was a poor student. If I always give this as general advice, I guess, for people, not financial advice or legal advice, but if you listen to me, now is, I think, still a good time to stack.
So 2014 was really early. How did people receive your book at that point?
I didn't write the book in 2014, but so the book just came out a few months ago. But I wrote articles about Bitcoin in 2000.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you get a lot of pushback on the articles?
It was so back in the day, this was like when conventional tech would actually write more about Bitcoin. So I wrote these articles in TechCrunch and VentureBeat. And I think at the time it was still like so new, right? So people didn't really push back. It was kind of like more of there's like a PR cycle when you start as like that new thing, right? You get a little bit of a shine, like
Yeah.
3-4 years. And so I felt like I wrote into that when it came to Bitcoin. Like for sure, there were people that, you know, they were like curious about it more than anything else. I think later on, especially now, it's become actually much more difficult to do that. So for example, if I were to write about Bitcoin for TechCrunch or VentureBeat, I suspect it would be much, much more difficult than it was before.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you're addressing a far better informed audience that expects you to get much more into the nuts and bolts, I would imagine.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that is one thing. Like, people are definitely a lot more educated about it. Back when I was writing about it in 2014, it was more like very broad strokes. And
Yeah.
now you have a lot of really, really smart people. I mean, I kind of it was funny. I kind of watched them all grow up because I was also pretty big on Clubhouse. I don't know if you all remember Clubhouse, but
Yep.
Right.
yeah, I was kind of part of the Bitcoin Clubhouse circuit. I'm still like an admin in the group. And so a lot of the like Bitcoin and some of the influencers, I mean, even some of the NFT crypto stuff started on there, right? Like Bored Apes, started on Clubhouse. Um, so, watching all of these people kind of grow up, kind of, and they're just like so many smart people that have like so many smart takes. And I'm just like, wow, this is, like seeing the emergence like Nick Carter, that was kind of like during the Clubhouse movement. And then afterwards, kind of like you have all these people like Lynn Alden and everyone else. So everybody has got like really smart views. On the technical side, yeah, there's definitely people who are more, I mean, because my day job didn't really involve like Bitcoin programming or anything like that, right? I wrote about it, but I wasn't I do code, but I didn't necessarily code with Bitcoin. I was doing more like data projects related to Bitcoin. Um, you have like these really smart technical resources now. I've worked with like, for example, Shinobi at Bitcoin Magazine and like a couple of other people, and you can listen to them talk about, why roll ups and like L2s or like whatever, like all the more technical stuff comes about. So definitely a very different ecosystem, information ecosystem. It does feel also like it's much harder. Back in 2014, you could have like talked about Bitcoin and that was the new thing, right? But now it's like 2024, Bitcoin's kind of old news. And so to find angles within that, you kind of have to think outside the box. But yeah, Thomas, I can see, yeah.
Yeah. So what is the general attitude towards Bitcoin in China at the moment? And I know they've got through kind of a roller coaster thinking about it. Where does it stand today?
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between the people and the state, right? And so the people, there's some people who love Bitcoin, love Web3, love crypto, right? Because it's a way. China's got a lot of capital controls, and basically you can't really exit money out of the system. If you make the money in China, it's very difficult to purchase foreign currency. There's a 50,000 USD a year per person limit on how much foreign currency you can purchase, and so there's this premium of like getting money outside of the Chinese system for many people, because if you're in the Chinese system, you can only really invest in like Chinese stocks. You can't even invest in like overseas stocks. You can invest in Chinese real estate. You can invest in Chinese bonds, but you don't have access to like global equity markets. You don't have access to like, I mean, it's illegal in many ways to get access to virtual currencies of any kind, Bitcoin or Tether or anything related to that. So for people, the average people, I've seen the gamut of opinions. I've seen, people who are, I would say, and I've said this many times, like I would characterize most of the interest in the Chinese side and the Asian side as seemingly very into like a lot of the L2 companies, layer two, which is kind of trying to build on top of Bitcoin. Like ordinals and runes, which are sort of like the NFTs of Bitcoin. A lot of that interest. When Bitcoin Magazine did the Hong Kong conference, they also had a really large ordinals conference alongside that, right? And I know, having talked to multiple people within China and also, I guess, Western Bitcoiners interfacing with Asia, that is where a lot of the ordinals, runes, and BRC20 activity seems to be happening, right? And BRC20 is kind of like a ERC20 token, but like Bitcoin form. So it's kind of taking all the Ethereum kind of goodies and wrapping it into Bitcoin. I have my own opinions about that for sure, but generally I see Chinese people, they're very like, they'll run like X Spaces or sometimes on Nostr or different places, like talking about like just different tokens and different economics and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of financial interest. There are people who are interested in it for like more of the cypherpunk implications of it. People who are writing books about Bitcoin education, people who are writing explicitly about how this separates money from state. And in China, that's very important because China has probably we discussed this maybe a little bit before, but the surveillance state that's there is so prevalent and so heavy that, Chinese people realize the consequences, right, of expressing themselves digitally. People have gone to jail for tweeting glory to Hong Kong to like 20, 40 Twitter followers, right? Like very, very, you can say dystopian kind of outcomes. And so there is kind of this like premium towards discussing, like understanding a surveillance state, right? Like I think in the United States and in Canada and quote unquote the West, there is a surveillance state, but it's a little bit harder. Like most people don't really encounter it as much day to day. I think the difference in China is that like, just to give you all a story, like we used to have on Clubhouse these rooms about China, and we opened a room and we were like, hey, like has anybody drank tea with the police, which is kind of code for like, did the cops call you in because of something you said online, right? And a few people did say yes, and I think this is something that's altogether too common, unfortunately. So the whole like, how do you resist censorship, right? How do you resist the Chinese government telling you where to spend your money and things like that? But also like, how do you resist the political censorship? And even though there's very, very few people who say it outright, because I think the consequences are very grave, you can kind of see it in the undertone. So to give you all an example of that, like a lot, like not a lot, but quite a few people from mainland China use Nostr. And I wrote an article about it and people responded to it and they were like, well, the reason why we use it, there's like one or two people who are like, we use it because, obviously if we use like WeChat or something like that, it'll get censored, right?
Hello, this is Trent Fowler, co-host of the Futurati podcast. One of the most common pieces of marketing advice I've come across is to know your audience and give them what they want. One difficulty in podcasting is that it's actually pretty hard to do this. None of the major platforms give us any way to reach out to you, our listeners, to find out what you enjoy about the Futurati podcast and what you'd like to see done differently. So we've decided to record this commercial and ask you directly to reach out to us. Head over to futuratipodcast.com, go to the contact page, and drop us a line. Tell us about your favorite and least favorite episodes, what you'd like to see us cover in the future, and anything else you want us to know. We produce this show for you, and we want your advice so we can make it even better. Thank you.
But if we're using Nostr, there isn't that censorship. But actually, the majority of people were more like, because Nostr only requires a key, doesn't require a phone number, doesn't require an email. This is something that I can trust more, because in China, if you give a phone number or an email, you can get tracked down, and your actions can be correlated. So Chinese people, I think of, and so I've seen Chinese people think of Bitcoin as kind of like a path away from that surveillance state. I've seen a lot of Chinese people think of Bitcoin as like a financial alternative, and I would say like writ large, like Web3, especially Hong Kong and different places as well. I have seen that. Like, again, have my own opinions on that, but that's just like what the research is. A lot of people using Tether, a lot of people using stable coins, a lot of people getting in and out of the system. Now, again, we've been talking about the Chinese people, how the Chinese party state feels about Bitcoin. They're generally quite negative or very negative. They're definitely the state that has been the most negative. I think there's some nuances about like, everyone always talks about like China banned Bitcoin. And, I even say it, even though technically that's not 100% correct. Like it's very confusing. I had an article that actually I wrote on ChinaBitcoinBook.com that explained it all. But essentially, there's multiple layers of technical and non-technical ways. So, for example, China has forbidden banks from using Bitcoin since 2013 in their domestic banking system. Since 2021, it has said that Bitcoin mining is bad for the whole of Chinese society. And many of the provinces have decided to kick out, or at least publicly kick out, many miners. There still is Bitcoin mining happening in China, though. And if you have, Bitcoin in China, it's not like the government's going to go after you necessarily. Like the courts have ruled that if you already hold Bitcoin, you can still, they're not going to go after you for it. It's seen as property. It's protected by the legal system, actually. But if you're trying to use it in a way that they interpret as money-like, right? So say, for example, you sign a contract and I hire you, Thomas, and you're in China and I'm in China, and I give you Bitcoin in the contract, and they interpret that as meaning like I'm using it in a money-like way. I'm not using it as a commodity anymore because we're not trading like gold for yen in order for me to make money in the gold. I'm using Bitcoin kind of like a currency at this point, right? I'm using it to pay you for services or goods.
Right.
Then the courts have ruled that to be illegitimate use of Bitcoin. So there's this fascinating interplay, but the short of it, if I want to take away from your question, it's a very complex one. Sorry, I had to go through many tangents, but the people, many different opinions, the range, the gamut. But in general, I see this interest towards the financial freedom aspect, as well as the fewer people who are kind of interested in the cypherpunk roots. But that is growing, and it's exciting to see all the while. And then the party state is, I think, has basically negotiated deals with because don't forget, like a lot of Bitcoin miners, mining pools, businesses grew out of China. Right. And so I feel like different people have different levels of entente with the Chinese party state, right? Like they're not necessarily, it's not like this big thing where they hey, we're going to, jail everyone who's ever involved in Bitcoin. Because that's a lot of people who are in the Chinese tech scene. That's a lot of powerful and rich individuals who got rich through, you can argue, foreign investment. And that's kind of what Chinese people, like the Chinese party state loves that part. And so they work with, for example, a local version of chain analysis. There's a company that's founded, and the police have cooperated with exchanges that have nominally left China. And some of the founders of these places, like some people are in exile. So CZ obviously left finance, and Jihan left. Jihan, who co-founded Bitmain, which is kind of the largest producer of custom mining chips for Bitcoin. But some people have stayed. And so there is kind of that level where the Chinese party state, I think, is trying to take advantage of Bitcoin where it advantages their citizens. But at the same time, because of the capital controls we mentioned, because of the environmental implications, according to them, and because of all these other things, a lot of different activities, including buying from exchanges, mining within China, are either expressly or implicitly forbidden. And the Chinese party state has definitely been the most aggressive country at enforcing that, way beyond the United States and other countries.
So in the past few years, the U.S. has gone very negative on thinking about all the crypto. And it seems like, in my mind, at least, that these countries are getting way behind. If you're negative on crypto, then you're going to get way behind on the technology, and other countries are going to run circles around you. In your mind, which countries are kind of leading the path forward in the crypto space?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, obviously there are some countries that are adopting it as legal tender or using it as reserves. So there's, in the case of El Salvador or Bhutan, I mean, these are obviously smaller countries, but they're kind of not only using it, but also encouraging adoption. El Salvador had the wallet and everything, they had Chivo, and they handed out Bitcoin to basically everyone, all those other things. I know Argentina more on the Ethereum front, but Argentina seems to be very Ethereum friendly from my understanding, since they implemented a curriculum like the Malay administration. So in terms of the countries, I do think, yeah, when you say the United States has been negative, I think maybe you're specifically referring to the SEC and different elements of that. Yeah.
Warren.
Yeah, Elizabeth Warren, the Warren agenda. I've also written about that, by the way. I actually interviewed the John Donnelly, who's the candidate who's running against Senator Warren in Massachusetts. But in Asia, it's not that different. I mean, I think Hong Kong and Singapore, they're trying to portray themselves as more like friendly to digital assets. But I've also heard from people in Hong Kong that even though there's quite a vibrant scene there, there's like 1,000 over-the-counter trading desks. You wouldn't expect it. There's an entire mall in Hong Kong, which actually has like, you can trade like Bitcoin, Tether, and things like that. There are different companies based there now. And so, it seems, at least on the face of it, that a Hong Kong or a Singapore is trying to position themselves to be a little bit more avant-garde. But I also have heard from players in the scene that Hong Kong, for example, makes it really difficult for you to have a banking account. Well, I know it's an ironic kind of thing, but you know how in the United States, Operation Choke Point 2.0 is also like a point of speculation, right? There are Silvergate and other banks that have been shut down because they won't interface with quote unquote crypto companies. And it's a big part of like how they run their business, or you have to have like, the on-ramps and off-ramps. And so some of that's happening in Hong Kong and Singapore as well. I mean, specifically Hong Kong, actually. But I've also heard that there are legislators in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is a little bit different from mainland China. So in Hong Kong, like, it's probably too long for me to go into like I covered the Hong Kong protests and like all the basic law and everything, and one country, two systems. There are a lot of really good resources. Like if your listeners want to read like Among the Braves, which kind of covers the protest, if they want to read more about Hong Kong just in general, like there's one country, two systems, like basic law. There's all that kind of stuff. But the short of it, for like the purpose of this question, is that Hong Kong is quite different from China in some regards still. And one of those regards is they still have control over their own central bank, and they still have control over their own kind of securities regulator, which is the SFC, as compared to the SEC. And so in Hong Kong, there are legislators, and the regulators, they obviously launched the spot Bitcoin ETF. They've had futures Bitcoin ETFs for quite a while. And so there is a little bit of, I think, sense that they're trying to advance at least the story and the narrative. There are legislators out there that advocate for Bitcoin. Actually, one of them, someone was telling me, is apparently like running a Bitcoin business and is a legislator in the Hong Kong Legisco. So there seems to be these signs. But then, of course, there's always the behind the scenes, right? There's it's still hard to open up a bank account. They are trying to crack down on like some of the exchanges. There's the licensure from the SFC and things like that. So there's a little bit of the optics and everything else. I do think right now the countries that are leading are probably like the smaller countries, like I mentioned before, Bhutan, and El Salvador, countries that are using Bitcoin or adopting it or encouraging businesses to settle there. Argentina might be kind of an example, although that's more of a crypto versus like Bitcoin specific. I do think if Trump gets elected, again, I have a lot of opinions about this, but if he does get elected and he does do a Bitcoin reserve and all these other things, and he appoints a different commissioner for the SEC, because his SEC it was Heather Pierce, right, back in the day, and she was definitely very different from Gensler in many regards. So I do think the U.S. Could start pioneering, but more important than that, like I think some countries may be like on the sidelines that are looking in. Like I've talked to some OTC desks, over-the-counter trading desks, and they seem to be trying to expand into the Middle East. They seem to be trying to expand in Asia. Yeah, so like Dubai and other places. So I know one that's about to open up an office in Dubai. I know Bitcoin Mag is hosting a MENA event, which is going to be in Qatar or Dubai, I believe. And so I think that, there's kind of like the Middle East is kind of emerging as they're kind of trying to figure out what's going on there. But if the United States really does embrace, you're going to see, I think, all these different countries like across the woodwork, traditional American allies and things like that, where, just because a U.S. president said it, they will reconsider it. And, China is actually going to be one of the countries that has to listen. Like no matter what their opinions of Trump are, like they have like 10,000 or 100,000 people assigned to literally follow every one of his words. right? So he's showing up at Bitcoin bars. He's talking about Bitcoin in this way, right? Like, that gets back to the Chinese part of the state.
Yeah, I've heard that Japan has kind of got all their regulatory issues ironed out, and that Dubai has most of theirs ironed out. Switzerland is trying to be a player. Yeah. So anyway, it seems like there's just a few minor things that could happen, and all of a sudden we're off to the races again. We're really close.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought up Japan and Switzerland. I mean, Japan, I'm not as familiar with what exactly is going on. I know there is a Bitcoin conference there now, Bitcoin Tokyo, and I know that there seems to be some interest. I know the South Koreans were really taken back by Terra. So I think that was kind of a setback in the Korean side. But in Japan, but Switzerland has, Relay, which is Switzerland based. It's always had Crypto Valley and Zug, Plan B, Lugano. I think like Tether is trying really hard to make Switzerland kind of like Lugano. I had a friend who went, and I was actually planning to go to Plan B for him, but didn't end up going this year. But yeah, they've got a lot of like merchants accepting Bitcoin. And so, and obviously that's right close to like Zug, I guess, right? Which is right where all the Ethereum people are.
Okay.
So that's fascinating. Thanks for walking us through all that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about something you raised nearer to the beginning, specifically with regards to the intersection between Bitcoin and policy in the Chinese context. So, I mean, do you have any predictions as to how this will ultimately play out? It sounds like there's a lot of nascent interest in the technology, especially since they live in the context of a really aggressive surveillance state. Do you think that, ultimately the government, the CCP, will end up cracking down hard on the technology? I mean, they must understand that it's an overt threat to their rule. But it sounds like for various reasons their hands are tied and they can't quite just do that yet. So do you think that it will continue to permeate throughout the rest of Chinese society, that it will furnish an off-ramp, a way of getting around the capital controls and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they've done a lot already. Don't get me wrong. They haven't. When I was talking about it, I said they haven't done everything they could do. I mean, everything would be like anybody who they know has had Bitcoin before in the past. Let's round them all up, physically detain them, and take their keys. Right? Like that would be like everything, right? Or like, I also don't think they systematically look at like the latest estimates from Cambridge are that there's still 20% of hash rate for Bitcoin that's still in China. I don't know if that's like entirely right because that's of a sample of 3 mining pools, 38% roughly of the Bitcoin mining hash rate worldwide. But, there definitely are still miners in China. It's less than it was before 2021, but that's still happening. So they could have done more, I guess is my point. Like Venezuela actually went in and I think they looked at power patterns and just literally seized every particular instance. So, the first thing I should say is like they have done a lot. It has been quite aggressive, and like trading from an exchange is essentially kind of forbidden. But it's a little bit like the VPN man in China, and even a little bit like how censorship works in China. I think people have this imagination that like the Chinese party state is like this omnipresent kind of entity that is in your pocket, in your phone, like checking on you every day kind of thing, right? Like Big Brother's watching you. But it doesn't quite work that way. Like they still have to like, how does censorship or how does like, like guiding the conversation scale over 1 billion plus people? And the answer is like, you really have to like enforce kind of like rules almost. And then you kind of have to like rule by self-censorship more than actual censorship. And some of the things actually also happen in the quote unquote West as well, right? Like so for example, like in China, it's not necessarily the case that, yes, there are words that are just straight out banned and they do go after that and they censor words directly. And obviously, like if you're looking at Tiananmen Square within China, you're not likely to find much, if anything. But at the same time, it's not necessarily like, oh, they're not able to like, it's just like impracticable to enforce. So like, for example, technically VPN usage is illegal in China, right? But like, if you're an average consumer of VPNs, first of all, it's like the local police and the cyberspace administration that are kind of enforcing this. It's like, how do you catch people like using VPNs in their own home, right? You either have to like systematically do it, or it has to be anecdotal. And so VPN usage, for example, like in China, they assign pretty light penalties if you're a consumer. Now, if you're running a VPN business, or if you're running, like a large scale VPN, they will go after you hard. There will be jail sentences. There will be, monetary fines. That's very similar to how they treat virtual currencies, right? So if you're Plus Token, if you did, and this is one of my favorite stories, like they got this massive Ponzi scheme, Plus Token, but the thing that people were most ashamed about in China was that it was just like this high school teacher, and he outclassed all these Beijing, Shanghai tech luminaries or whatever, and they got 190,000 Bitcoin, I think I forget how much Ethereum, but like China seized it all. But it was a very impressive haul for a high school teacher from I forget which province. But with stuff like that, right? If you do that, or if you're operating an OTC trading desk, or if you're like explicitly like the crypto king, like they arrested the quote unquote crypto king of China, right? They gave him, I think, like 12 or 14 years in jail. Yeah, they will go after you hard. But if you're like an individual user, it kind of gets to the point of like, this is why Bitcoin and Nostr and all these technologies are freedom tech in the first place. Or you can say stablecoins to a certain extent, although they also are centralized, right? But that's the whole beauty of it, because yeah, like the Chinese party state has done a lot of things to try to restrict usage of it. But it's the same thing as like restricting like email usage, or restricting like DNS, or restricting, like you can't, it's a neutral platform that has a lot of economic utility and benefit that people from abroad are willing to pay a lot of money for access to. So like now I think it's, like it's just like so difficult for the Chinese party state to enforce. They could be doing more, but I honestly don't know how much more they're willing to do. Because they have a line, right? They have a line, because otherwise the party state becomes ungovernable. Because if you're like, all of a sudden today, I'm going to make all cell phones illegal, right? I'm making an absurd example, but that, that's like kind of like, there's like gradations within that. Yeah, obviously the Chinese party state is not going to be able to like do that necessarily, right? Even though they've tried really hard. Now, where this goes in the future, one thing that most people don't talk about is the Chinese economy is doing very poorly. It is at their 5% growth goal this year, which they're struggling to reach, I think, an annualized rate of 4.4 or something like that. Don't quote me exactly on those figures, but the 5% goal, quote me on that, would be the lowest since 1976, which is when Mao died. And so right now, if you're in China, real estate is down, especially in the top cities. Stocks are down. So people are like investing their money into like gold ETFs or whatever that comes their way. They're investing their money in Chinese bonds, but there's not a lot of really attractive options, and you don't have access to the greater world financial market. You can't have access to US equities. You don't have access to, virtual currencies and things like that, unless you get your money out, whether that's through stable coins or anything else. So I do think that Chinese people, now the activity definitely dulled between 2021 and now, but I think there's going to be a really strong demand factor from Chinese people to invest in things that will give them financial return of some kind, because otherwise they just have no options otherwise, right? And sometimes when you hear Chinese people talk about it, they're like, oh, we're like playing at this, or we're gambling or whatever. But I do think it's more meaningful than that, is what I tell people, because people forget that the Chinese system is very tightly controlled. Like how you spend your money, how you invest your money, that's like the party state's way of controlling its economy. It's the way of giving economic freedom without giving political freedom, right? It's like one of many tools the party uses, and one of its most important. And so I think there's going to be a lot more tension. Just, the youth unemployment's really high in China now. So there's just like so many factors for why I think Chinese people writ large will be looking at alternatives to the Chinese financial system, whether that ends up being virtual currencies. I mean, definitely there are some people that are using it in that way.
Are you enjoying this episode of the Futurati podcast? If so, please like it, give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your friends. By far, the best way to help us grow is to spread the word on social media, which will expose our content to more people and help us continue to bring you interviews with world-leading experts in AI, quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, and so much more. Thank you in advance.
So let's move this forward a few years. You celebrate hard on 2039, December 31st, and you wake up the first day of 2040. What's different? What's different about that year than now?
How do you choose the years, Thomas? Because I think you asked someone else 2032, but I'll try my best with 2040. So what does the world look like? I'm going to give a little bit more of a general answer, actually, because why not? I think Bitcoin is the world's money at that point.
Wow.
I do believe that. I think like what I've always told people, or it will fail miserably. I mean, I think it's either one. But if I'm celebrating, I'm assuming I think Bitcoin will be the world. I do think maybe it's just slightly more than 2040. I think maybe slightly more. But what I've always told people, like medium term, even my Forbes writings and stuff like that, like I don't really have a good idea of like where the price will be. I don't pretend to say like next year it's going to be 150K, or like through my technical analysis it'll be 200K or whatever. That's not the kind of analysis I'd like to do. But by 2040, I think that you're looking at like a lot of structural things, right? Like, for example, just the United States, I guess, is the case most people are familiar with, but this is also happening in China, right? Where the state has to apply on more and more debt. The monetary supply is not backed by anything. And I think that there's going to be multiple instances or events. So people always rush into the like freedom tech, like VPNs and I've written about this several times, when it matters to them. And when it matters to them is when their access is cut off to something.
Right.
And so I think like, you will see, I'm a little bit medium term pessimistic. I think there's a lot of factors for why our world will be, I think like there were like 30 or 40 years of pretty relative peace. I think that might change a little bit as we're looking forward in the next 20, 30 years. And I think one of the consequences of that is like people will start to realize, even in countries that are like core countries, allies of the United States, the importance of having like a solid, stable money that is independently determined. So that's one thing. Maybe by then, machine learning and all these agents will have replaced, all economic, or like we're on our next, 10x, drive in terms of productivity and things like that. I think that, yeah, there's going to be really interesting. I mean, the amount of energy, I look a lot at like the amount of energy that humanity currently controls or has access to or harnesses, right? And that kind of runs into the whole Bitcoin conversation as well, because Bitcoin is one of those uses. Machine learning is one of those other uses. And you're seeing it kind of stall a little bit, like it's still growing. But the idea is like, we're trying to accomplish a really tricky thing, I think, which is like, we're trying to continue energy growth and get to like maybe that next stage of just like energy prosperity, while explicitly acknowledging that over the past 100 or 150 years, we were kind of using biologically derived, like sped up energy sources, right? So like fossil fuels, basically, right? That have a little bit of a finite span. Like we basically are consumed like solar energy condensed over millions of years in the time frame of like decades, right? And so I think if we get it right, we'll be able to pull it out. I'm very optimistic, and maybe I'll seem really foolish in 2040 when I'm celebrating about this, but I'm pretty optimistic we'll be able to figure out the energy problem. I've spent some time thinking about some of the routes. I'm not by any means like an energy expert, so I don't want to get too much into it, but I think if we are able to figure that out, then there's like the extension of like just compute. And if you think about Bitcoin and AI, ML is kind of like the amount of energy we can harness, then goes into the amount of compute. And you see that kind of indirectly, like we were talking about the Middle East, for example. The Middle East is transitioning from being an energy superpower into trying to get into a compute superpower. They're trying to buy as much, NVIDIA chips as they can get access to through different companies like N42. They are trying to get Bitcoin, crypto, or whatever into the ecosystem because they know the energy that they're sitting on is no longer something that is necessarily going to see them through the next 200, 300 years, right? So if we do figure it out, I think there's going to be some really, really interesting things. I'm hopeful for life extension. I'm actually really hopeful that we'll understand the human brain much better. I think that's maybe like one of the next immediate frontiers I'm thinking about, just with the Connectome project and different things. But yeah, that's a little bit more of a general answer, but that's hopefully some previews of the 2040 conversation. I hope I'll be celebrating and having, Bitcoin is the world's money. We're in multi-planetary, so we're transitioning money between, here and Mars, and that's probably not going to be physical cash. Yeah, this is all probably a little bit aggressive to 2040, maybe 2060, but and then, if you figure out the energy problem and then the more compute you harness, kind of like the more problems you can solve. And there's definitely some like fundamental like biology and biotech problems that'd be really interesting to.
Well, yeah, there's quite a few uses for power that are kind of driving us to the breaking point. The electric vehicles, in addition to the compute power and crypto mining. Incidentally, in 2040, you will only be able to buy life extension with Bitcoin.
Yeah.
You heard it here first, guys.
Well, that'll be it. Well, Alcor Foundation, I mean, Hal Finney did the Alcor Foundation. He might have paid in Bitcoin, for all we know.
Yeah, I'm kidding. I wanted to pick up a little bit on your threads about Chinese economic performance. You get these sort of a tale of two Chinas where China is this unstoppable dragon monster that's going to consume the world. And you've got these other people who say, no, they're building these ghost cities and then they have to knock them down. The GDP statistics are inflated. You sound vaguely bearish to me on China. So I wanted to get your broader thoughts on this. And also, I'm also particularly interested in the philosophical ramifications of that. So, I mean, you said, if I recall correctly, that China's got the lowest economic growth it's had since Mao died in 1976. So it seems almost as though Xi Jinping might have a kind of mandate of heaven that's expiring if he's not delivering. And I don't know if that concept is still operative in Chinese politics or if they even think that way, but maybe you could comment on that as well. I mean, does that challenge his legitimacy if he's seen as this all-powerful ruler who in fact can't deliver?
Yeah, I like that descriptor, like vaguely. If I were to describe my answers to things, maybe vaguely or fortune cookie-esque. No, I'm kidding. But let's talk about both, right? So China's economy, how do I think about it? Like, I think that when most people talk to me about it, and they're coming from like the more Western perspective, right? It is kind of what you're saying. There are people who write, I think it's a function of just like, you have to write books about something, or you have to write, articles about something. And so there is a school of people that consistently are predicting that China will fail in 2012 and 2015 and 2018 and 2019 or whatever. It just goes on and on, right? I think Gordon G. Chang is like one of these people, for example. He's got like a book out every once in a while that says China, but if you follow the thread, you're like, you've written like 2 or 3 of these. I think that there are a lot of fundamental reasons to be pessimistic. I don't know if there's like necessarily like a breaking point to it, but for example, like the youth unemployment point I just made is very important. The demographics are very unfavorable. And so Chinese population is declining because of the one-child rule. I think that was like probably, I wrote this article just like going hard after Charlie Munger because he believed that the one-child rule was like the sign that Chinese policy making was like wise. And I was like, it's just such a bad mistake because, and you're kind of seeing it now because now it's like all the young people, first of all, they're not getting jobs because there's fewer of them, but also because they like the old guard isn't willing to hand over the jobs. So the youth unemployment is quite low, quite high, very, very high. I think it's a record high, actually. I was just reading this morning. 18.8% or something. It's close to like
wow.
Europe had its crisis, right? They're talking about like 20% like youth unemployment, absurdly high. And so, yeah, and I think China also has like a lot of difficulties with immigration. So the States and Canada, and I mean, they also, I don't, there's also like reasons why the economy there is, a little bit throwing on debt and everything. But the United States does have kind of an advantage in the sense that it traditionally has taken the smartest or smarter or people from across the world and kind of like, it's the whole melting pot thing.
Yeah.
Just like bring them all together, bring them in. Like China doesn't really have that. And I think this is also going to be a problem for like Japan and other places too, where their demographics are really unfavorable, right? Like their population is getting much older. The health costs are going to be much higher. And then your working age population is just going to become lower. So yeah. And right now at this current moment, Chinese economic growth is going really, really poorly. And so you asked in terms of the correlation. So Mao's death was like a really meaningful moment in Chinese history because that was the moment that China began. It was more after, it was not more 1978, but that was about the moment China began, I think, the most interesting economic experiment we've seen in the 20th century, which is socialism with Chinese characteristics, a mix of capitalism, but also heavy political control from the party state, right? Since that moment, China has, China's GDP per capita at that moment used to be a few $100s per person. It's the equivalent to North Korea. Since that moment, not only has it been, it's the, like outside of like Botswana or like other countries that every once in a while kind of like creep up to it, it has been the fastest growing in terms of GDP growth and over a large base, right? Like 1.3 billion people. But that came at, I believe the reason, and my book actually gets, when Mao Hold Bitcoin actually gets into it, it starts the 1980s, because I believe like that was the beginning of shifting from a command economy into a more free economy where people could start their own companies, right? But the party always wanted to maintain control. I happen to be biased. I hope that the Chinese people and the Chinese diaspora, of which I'm a member, seize the political and economic freedoms I think they so rightly deserve. But it is kind of, so far they've gone the economic side. And for some people, that's been like enough per se. But the curve has really changed recently because I think now with Xi in power, Xi has done things that he hasn't necessarily like changed it back to be like more Maoist or command economy, but he has kind of, through political repression being heavy-handed, for example, with what happened in Hong Kong. Now Hong Kong is no longer really an attractive bridge for foreign capital, or not the attractive bridge it used to be. And that is squarely based on the response of really Xi to the protests and to the demands for more universal suffrage and freedom of press, right? And so it turns out if you put a national security law, you arrest members of the media, and you arrest people for running for a certain political party, there are some consequences economically, and I think Hong Kong is still suffering through that. I think that people see Xi. I actually met someone who's like trying to write a book about this. There is like a little bit of a malaise. I will say that some of that is based off of like people who are like in Beijing, Shanghai, like top cities. So Evan Osnos, who's kind of like the famous China watcher, he went to Beijing, he wrote about it. He wrote this book in 2011 or something like that was called The Age of Ambition. It was trying to explain how China was growing so rapidly because there were so many entrepreneurs that had just been a generation away from poverty and absolute starvation under Mao, right? But now this the next article he wrote was The Age of Malaise, and just sitting down and talking with people about how like ever since Xi has taken over, and now Xi has taken over power, he has done something unprecedented after the 1970s too, which is that he has taken another term in office. So traditionally, Chinese leaders rotate after 10 years in power. But in this case, Xi will not be rotating.
I politely declined to step down.
Yeah. Well, he basically like got rid of the like system of term limits that Deng had placed in order for there not to be another Mao. Now, he hasn't done things like Mao was a little bit like crazy, I think. Like he
Not a great guy. Not a great guy.
yeah, let's kill the sparrows, let's kill the landlords. He was very much like economically speaking, very I want to say like kind of a brute who didn't really
Yeah.
understand economics too well, or like second order effects.
That's so
But I don't-
unusual for communist dictators.
Yeah, I know, seriously. But
They're famously light in their touch.
yeah. So she is not quite like that, by the way. Like he isn't like, like let's return to Maoism and like, the people like he's like, hey, central bank, you should be more like the Federal Reserve, right? Hey, public companies, let's list them more. So that's where it gets a little bit confusing. But I will say that she has led to like this the economic slowdown, I think, is blamed on his governance model. I just think that like like he's been so heavy-handed and he's been so directly involved, and they've done things that are like, he's gone back and forth on this, but he kind of has to do this message of like common prosperity and like shutting down some IPOs and like anti-corruption, which is like going after some leaders and stuff like that. And I think you see the consequences of it. I mean, people are scared, people are afraid, and foreign investors are afraid. I don't know that foreign investors want to invest as much in China as they did before. There's also the geopolitical tensions. I mean, obviously, that's also brewing into it. I feel like the world is kind of fracturing apart with the trade wars and everything like that. But yeah, and as to whether or not he's lost the man in heaven, the man in heaven is still a thing. I think Chinese leaders, I mean, one thing I always highly encourage people, ever again on podcasts like this too, is like read more about Chinese history and read more about the Chinese exemplars and the Chinese schools of philosophy, like legalism, the Taiping Rebellion. There's just so much of Chinese history. I can't go into all the items, but one thing that's always gotten me is that Chinese people will usually know both the history of China and also the Western examples. So they tend to have like two keys of reference, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so like, for example, like a lot of Chinese people will spend a lot of time debating the politics of Rome, but they will equally know about like the Ming dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, right? And then versus like Western people, it's like, well, what are my examples with inflation? It's Weimar Germany. What are my examples of like a dictator being assassinated? It's Kaiser, right? So in the Chinese example, like the man into heaven, there's like kind of this dual track, right? So she has a lot of like Marxist references, has a lot of references to like Western philosophy, has a lot of references to Chinese philosophy, and a lot of those same concepts still kind of reign. One thing that is much more sharp in China than other places, and why I think the country, this is a force against there being a breaking point to all the factors I mentioned. So in China, they study the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, like maniacs. And she specifically does that. I think in a way that the United States doesn't really appreciate, because I, for example, don't know of any very serious or schools of scholarship on that front. But in China, this is like a personal obsession of Xi Jinping, because it is part of a register of Chinese history where a unified Chinese state will fracture into many warlords, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a primal Chinese fear, and especially informed by the Soviet experience, that if the Chinese party state were to fall apart, that things would go really badly. And I've heard this anecdotally, like, for example, if you go, there are Chinese students who will say like, well, why do you support Hong Kong? They're just trying to turn China into Syria or Lebanon or Libya, right? So there is that force. And the second thing is like the younger generation in China is very nationalistic. And I worry about that. It's actually one of the reasons why I'm medium-term pessimistic. It's very different. For those of us who are born, like, for example, a Canadian passport, I don't think we realize the difference it makes for like within a generation. A lot of Chinese people, for better or for worse, like they go abroad and they're like, wow, these countries allow us in now. They treat us with more respect because they're more economically wealthy, right? And so there is an upsurge of pride in some circles that is happening in China right now. And so, for example, when Pelosi came, I mean, again, I'm not trying to overinflate this, because if you go on X or Twitter today and you look up whatever thing, you'll find the worst takes, and you'll be, you know, think that humanity is doomed to die in the next like 2 days. But you know, on WeChat and these different channels, when Pelosi came to Taiwan, people were calling for her plane to be shot down. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah. There was a very strong nationalistic sentiment, and there's a lot of that happening in China right now. So that might be a little bit of a counterforce.
Yeah, real quick, the name of your book uses the name Mao.
Yeah.
And Mao had nothing to do with Bitcoin, but is that a big draw in China right now? If you put that name on a book?
I don't know if it's a big, well, I mean, it was the one thing that people in both China, kind of like when I mentioned the two registers, right? It was the one name that people in the West know and people in China know, unquestionably.
Okay.
So that was kind of like, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I would have wanted to call it Wood and Xiaoping Hold Bitcoin, but then no one would know who that is, or no, not very many people know who that is.
Yeah.
Is the fear about a breaking China motivated in part by, now let's see, let me take that again. So part of what caused the breakup of the Soviet Union was that you had these different cultural and ethnic tectonic plates that had been sewn together. Right? You got the Romanians, you got the Yugoslavians, the Georgians, you've got all these people, the Moldovans, and then there had to have been a certain amount of tension.
Yeah,
pulling all those things apart. I'm sort of vaguely aware that a lot of the nationalism in China is centered around the Han ethnicity, and I'm just curious as to whether or not that has the same pulling and rupturing impetus behind it. Like if there's as much people wanting to separate out along ethnic lines, or if it's purely a fear motivated by the idea that there will be warlords that emerge and that it will not necessarily have much to do with ethnicity. I'm just curious about the like undercurrents that might cause that ice on the surface to break apart, and how it might be different than the situation which prevailed in the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some of that. So specifically, I think the reaction in Xinjiang and the Uyghur people is because of that. So China, because of, and the other example they look at is Yugoslavia a lot, which is again, a forgotten thing that they kind of, but both. And so I think they're very sensitive. They do a really, like in the state propaganda level, they're really like, they're called the Mingzu, like the small minorities, right? And like the recognized minorities. And if you go to the like state galas and stuff like that during Spring Festival, they always have like representatives. You know, during the Olympics, they're always trying to like highlight this like ethnic unity and union. But the reality is that China is a Han majority country, and not only a Han majority, but even within the Han, there are many different divisions, right? So, for example, the Hokkien people are technically Han, but also just like in a sublinguistic group, Han people in Guangzhou are very different. That's the province right next to Hong Kong, than people in Beijing, right? People who are from China in the north, they might be part Manchu, they might be part Korean, they might be, you know what I'm saying? Like there are these lines. And I think that not only does China think about this a lot, because again, that was a really big part of the Soviet Union splitting. So it's ethnic lines. There definitely is like a lot of history of Han Chinese people splitting apart. You just forget even the ethnic and the racial parts, potentially. But where China is most sensitive is the ethnic part, and specifically Tibet and Xinjiang. I mean, this is like a huge ongoing thing. I think this is why the Chinese party state is so sensitive to criticism. Like I actually, so when I was on Clubhouse, we used to run rooms and we would get like the Uyghur, some of them whose families have been kidnapped. One, for example, Rayhan Assad, who her brother has been kidnapped since 2000. It's been a while. I think it's been 10 years or something, maybe less. I don't know. But anyways, he's disappeared. And we had these rooms with like mainland Chinese people. And she was like talking to them about like her brother's experience and stuff like that. Clubhouse was a really wild moment. That was like the one moment where I felt like mainland Chinese internet and the Western internet really combined together. But the mainlanders were always a little bit resistant because they were always like, you know, this is how the United States is trying to divide us. They're trying to take like these ethnic tensions. These are like China's internal problems. So it's kind of like, because it's like the state sphere, it becomes kind of like a fear. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
and I think that's actually part of the reason why they went so extreme and continue to be so extreme to the Uyghur people, is this fear that there will be like ethnic factionalism, right? That's why they were really hard on Tibet as well. Because the
Interesting. Yeah.
fear, yeah, because the fear is that the country might fracture. And with Tibet and Xinjiang, you have the additional thing of like, well, already there's like separate leadership structures. And there's separate cultural reasons and separate religious reasons and separate ethnicities. And there is an independence movement for both, right? There is a government in exile in Tibet, and there is a government, they call it East Turkestan movement for Xinjiang. So there are independence people, the Uyghurs, who want to seek independence for Xinjiang as like an independent country. So these do exist, and that is where you've seen the strongest repression, the strongest response in China, where like in Xinjiang, for example, they ban Bitcoin, they like put you in detention camps for like using encrypted apps and all the other things. There's a good report on this, weather report from Xinjiang, if people are interested, by Ben Mao. That's always like the reference article I use. And then I just don't feel like qualified to speak on behalf of like the Uyghur people and everything related to that. But if people want to listen to them from their own side, Rayhan Assad is also great. She actually goes to Yale or Harvard, I forget which one, but Harvard, I believe. And she writes a lot in English about the experience with her brother. So anyways, that's kind of the kind of more the ethnic lines. So that definitely does play a role in how China thinks about that. And that is like kind of the counterweight, right? Like, yeah, China could break apart because the economy is doing really bad and a lot of people don't have jobs. And also there's 30 million men who will never get married because the one-child rule favored boys over girls.
Yeah.
So there's all these like bad factors. But then there's also a lot of like, like this national pride, and then there's like these fears of like what will happen if the party state splits apart, so they all kind of come together. So I can't predict a definitive thing. I will make I have said this in public, so I don't really care. Like, I don't know if it's that bold, but I do think if China invades Taiwan, then that is likely to be a failure point I don't think Chinese society will react as Russia has to the Ukraine situation. I feel like Putin has somehow, and I'm by no means an expert, and I don't want to be too out of scope here, but I feel like somehow the Russian people, despite the fact that like they're going through this horrendous war, tons of people are dying, seem to not be revolting or like it seems like the sanctions, at least from how I see it, has actually redoubled their commitment to like, this war economy and all this other stuff, right? I think in China, there's going to be a little bit of a difference. The PLA the People's Liberation Army, which is China's military, has not fought a war since 1979, since they invaded Vietnam. Although they did invade Vietnam, so that is one thing I always remind people, because some other people always say China has never invaded. China is such a peaceful country, and they invaded that in 1949. They invaded, anyways. So, but the point I'm trying to make with that is like the military is very ill prepared. Now, China has the advantage in terms of manufacturing, but it's just the military is just so ill prepared, and Xi Jinping is way out of his element. Because Deng Xiaoping, when he led China, he was still part of that generation of leaders that had been on the Long March, that had fought in the wars. He successfully fought against the Japanese and the nationalists, right? Xi Jinping has none of that. He has no military background. And I think this is where, one of the most famous corruption cases, they were firing rockets at Taiwan, and like 1/10 of them had water in them, so they didn't go. So they had to execute or disappear or jail the Minister of Defense in China, the rocket force head. So I just think that if it push comes to shove and China actually does invade Taiwan or does do like a naval blockade, that could be a breaking point. But I don't think it happens I don't think it'll happen in the sense of like people are like, oh, the economy is doing so badly, there's like a crash.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe China will fall apart. Like, I just don't think, based off of like, the history of it. Also, there's not, they've been like the number of protests in China is very, very low. I wrote about some of them in my books, in my book, When Mao Hold Bitcoin. But yeah,
Yeah.
like, there just isn't a lot of dissent or natural dissent movement. Or frankly, at this point, like anybody you can point to as a potential leader. So like in Russia, you had Navalny, well, before he was murdered or went to jail or whatever, right? In other countries, you might have like a natural leader. In China, there's like some of the people who left after Tiananmen Square. There was Liu Xiaobo, who was the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, but Liu Xiaobo is now dead. And then the Tiananmen Square leaders have been out of China since 1989. So they've been out for forever. They have no like kind of domestic base. And they're older now. They're much older. Some of them are now 70 or, well, not maybe not 70, but like 55 and 60 or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of like my take on the whole China thing. It's a very complex question. I'm sorry that doesn't digest well in a podcast necessarily, but people ask me, I'm always like, well, these are the forces for, these are the forces against. What I'm fairly certain about is if China like invades another country like Russia did, it will have a much harder time around it. I think the Chinese people will not accept that very readily. Like I think very often about like who's your officer class going to be, and I don't think, like, I actually had a debate with someone in China about this, and he was like, "Well, we're gonna just send all these like rural 30 million kids to go and die in Taiwan," but I'm like, okay, but then who are your officers? And then as soon as it starts hitting the Han ethnic families, they haven't done things like they haven't even arrested people. They haven't gone after families. They haven't arrested people in the Han majority the way they've treated the Uyghurs, but they might have to if there's a war and there are protests or anything else. So I think that would be a more natural breaking point. And I think if China actually really did try to invade Taiwan, it would break the party. I'm fairly confident in that.
But you have a copy of your book you can hold up?
Oh, yeah, that's a good call. I'm going to go grab one right now.
Yeah.
Do you need a dynamic and knowledgeable speaker for an event? Thomas Fry and me, Trent Fowler, are both seasoned keynote speakers, able to converse on a wide array of topics to audiences of all sizes and skill levels. Go to the contact page at futuratiepodcast.com to book Thomas or myself today, and let us apply our years of experience in public speaking to make your event a smashing success.
You dropped the Taiwan bomb.
Right. That's what I was saying about with the bookshelf and everything, but that's the book right here.
Well, fantastic. I have not had a chance to read all of it yet, but I did read big chunks of it in preparation for the interview so far. Excellently written, excellently researched, very fascinating topic. And as you pitched it, it lies at the intersection of Bitcoin and policy in one of the more consequential states in the world today. So I highly recommend everybody check it out and read it. Do you guys still do Clubhouse rooms?
I don't, well, you mean like me, like personally?
Yeah, it sounds like a cool place to stay apprised of all this.
No, unfortunately not. We used to. We had, so I used to run the largest English-based China room on Clubhouse called Tiansha. So we would cover it all the time. But yeah, these days not. I'm an admin of the Bitcoin Club, but I haven't really been on Clubhouse lately.
Okay.
Gotcha. Okay. So where can people follow your work in addition to getting the book?
X, Roger H 1991, so everyone knows when I'm born. And Noster. I don't know if your followers have Noster, but low-key at noster-verified.com. Or if you find up Loki, like the Greek, not Greek, the Norse trickery god, Loki.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I feel like we could go for 2 more hours, especially with the Taiwan bomb you dropped at the end there. But we may have to have you on to talk again, but we really appreciate your time. It's a great book. I'm going to finish the rest of it, and we wish you the best of luck, man. This is fascinating stuff.
Thank you. Thank you both. Hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully your audience will enjoy.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.